Well, good afternoon, everybody. Um, I hope that everybody is doing well and healthy. Um, First of all, thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Emile Monfils. I'm joined by my colleague Richard Slimme. And in the next 60 minutes or so, we will guide you through the topic controversy. I believe this topic is a very important topic, perhaps not now, but it will become more important after the Corona times. Well, during the webinar, you might have some questions for us. You can ask the questions via the chat box, and we will try to, of course, answer those questions immediately. Richard, thank you also for joining this webinar. Perhaps a few words from your side before kicking off with this webinar.
Yes, thank you, Emile. Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Slimme. I'm one of the managing directors of Quantera Global. I think everybody will understand that 60 minutes is by far not enough to discuss every issue about controversy. The reason for us to have this webinar is for foremost to make people aware of the fact that things are going to change. And you should better be prepared. So after the 60 minutes, I hope that everybody has learned some insights and at least is triggered to consider whether there is some action to take in specific circumstances. So back to you, Emile.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Well, why this topic at this moment and why to focus on controversy right now? Well, looking at the world in this current state, we see that controversy of that the coronavirus is really affecting companies, businesses, multinationals. They are really now struggling to survive and to make the best of the situation. So, of course, governments now are really willing to provide certain aid, state aid, financial measures to help those companies survive this crisis. But as you may appreciate, well, tax revenue will decline, and at some point, governments will need to fill their pockets again. So that might be one of the main reasons to expect that in the near future, after the Corona times, a lot of companies, multinationals, will be affected by, well, transfer pricing disputes, by audits. Of course, we see that a lot of factors are involved in this matter. We have the transparency, but also the fact that, well, transfer pricing is somewhat frowned upon by some people, publicly or even in politicians. Why? They say, well, transfer pricing is associated with tax avoidance.
I think that is something that you put very delicately, Emile. I think in general, I think you could easily state that in the public opinion, transfer pricing is some sort of a devil's instrument, which obviously is not right, but it's being fed by a lot of publications, by a lot of incidental cases where MNEs might not have been paying much tax or too little tax in the eyes of certain people. But it's the public opinion, and I think that is becoming more and more an issue to consider. Whereas, let's say, 10 years ago, public opinion was obviously also there, but it has been put more on the front of the tax considerations and of politics on how to deal with tax, and especially transfer pricing is something that people have a strong opinion about. Not, let's say, influenced by a lot of expert knowledge, but everybody has some opinion about whether or not MNEs are paying their fair share of tax. I think if you look at the reason for us to focus on controversy right now is that a lot of developments come together. We've seen BEPS that has going on for a number of years, resulting in a lot of actions, a lot of new standards, a lot of new issues to consider and things to amend and change by MNEs. a lot of different interpretations will occur dealing with BEPS cases. And it's being now, let's say, joined by another development that has come along, mandatory disclosure of certain, let's say, tax structures that have been considered and implemented by companies being disclosed and focusing tax authorities on high-risk potential cases. And then as a third pillar, in this respect, as you already mentioned, Emil, that due to the corona crisis, the initial behavior, luckily, of a lot of countries and authorities is to support their business in staying alive and making sure that they overcome the crisis and keep running business. But there's a lot of spending going on. There's a lot of public money poured into the economy in supporting business. And at one moment in time, there will be a need for almost all countries to start collecting again instead of just spending money. So if you join those three elements, a lot of new rules, new interpretations on BEPS, mandatory disclosure, which focus attention of tax authorities on a certain type of structures where transfer pricing is a major part of it, as well as a need for cash, that all combines into, I think, a situation where we expect a lot of audits to take place in the near future, a lot of audits to take place with a mindset that is being influenced by public opinion and politics, that transfer pricing is suspicious. Transfer pricing deals with M&Es, and M&Es are, let's say, not the most popular taxpayers at this moment in time in the eyes of the general public. So that all combines into a situation where you might expect transfer pricing, especially, and taxation of M&Es in more general, to become a focus area. And if you think about the mindset in which it will take place, we will also expect that not only that the audit density will increase, but also the mindset and the scrutiny and the aggressiveness of tax authorities in dealing with those audits is likely to be different than a couple of years ago. All that together was enough reason for us to at least give a heads up to the people in the audience that things are coming. Winter is coming in terms of a recent Netflix series. Winter is coming, and you should better prepare.
Indeed, Richard. Controversy. Well, looking at the definition of controversy, it's, in my opinion, not really only dealing with a dispute that has emerged. I think it's more than that. You're thinking about controversy in a way of how should I communicate with tax authorities? What kind of considerations should I take into account? Also taking a look at my transfer pricing policy.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Emil. I think when I talk about controversy, I'm not just talking about how to deal with an audit. That is part of controversy. But in my opinion, controversy is as broad as any interaction or anticipated interaction with tax authorities by a multinational enterprise. So that starts with the design of your transfer pricing policies. That starts with thinking about how to make sure that you're able to support your policy and that you're able to implement it properly. And if an audit happens, that you're organized enough to deal with it in an effective way. So it's not just the audit itself, it's a lot of time and considerations before that happens, but also after the fact of an audit. You need to deal with it, and you need to make sure that any results from it are taken into account also. So it's a broad scope, it's a very broad field of interaction with tax authorities that I call controversy. And when I talk about controversy, I'm looking at the broad spectrum.
Yeah, that's good to hear, Richard. Thank you for clarification. During this webinar, well, 3 main topics will be discussed by Richard and myself. One already mentioned by Richard, transparency, one of the 3 pillars of the BEPS project, the need for more transparency. We will talk about strategy. What should you do when you expect a tax audit? How can you prevent it? Are you able to prevent a tax audit? What should you do? What not to do? And then we will also touch upon the transfer pricing control framework as perhaps part of being in control. Then, after this nice introduction, Richard, I think I want to trigger you, and I want to trigger you with a bold statement, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your reaction to this one. All M&Es are crooks. They do not pay enough taxes.
Yeah, unfortunately, Emil, I recognize phrases like that just by reading newspapers. And discussing with let's say people not really educated in tax matters in a lot of detail. I think public opinion is being influenced over the last few years in a way that this is being a general mindset. M&Es do not pay tax; they avoid paying tax, and if they cannot avoid it, they make sure it is as little as possible. The Booking.com and the KLM pictures in the slide may not be specifically about tax, but it's being about public opinion that is being driving a lot of actions. It has also been driving the BEPS actions, resulting in a lot of measures and a lot of scrutiny on transfer pricing, which, by the way, is fine by me, because a lot of let's say abusive behavior of transfer pricing as an instrument actually did occur in the past, and there will have some impact by the BEPS development. But the way that M&Es are being perceived by the broader general public is, to say the least, not very positive.
Now, would you now say that Corona is making it even worse, because now in the situation with Corona, you see that Booking, Air France, KLM, Amazon, EasyJet, all big companies, they ask for aid towards the governments, to taxes, to authorities.
Yeah, well, obviously that doesn't have anything to do with paying tax, but still it does impact the general public's opinion about whether a large M&E actually is in need of help or should get scrutinized. And I think the behavior of some M&Es during the Corona crisis has had an impact on public, where they see big M&Es with a lot of money in the bank, still holding up their hands in trying to receive financial support from authorities, and at the same time paying a lot of dividends and money to their shareholders. And at the end of the day, a lot of people consider that, well, at the end of the day, we will pick up the bill for all the support that's being provided to those M&Es, and that relates back to the tax collection. Obviously, I think M&Es are not in the best spot right now in dealing with public perception. So yeah, I'm not agreeing to the statement, but I'm afraid that a lot of people would agree.
And would you now, because this is, let's say, the public opinion of multinationals and perhaps also of various politicians, that this mindset could also affect the mindset of tax authorities in the way that they will now try to initiate an audit, tax audit, transfer pricing audit, and perhaps be more aggressive towards an M&E?
Well, I'm afraid that the general mindset of the public has influenced politics, and politics, well, at the end of the day, is it's the boss of the tax administration. So people conducting tax audits, tax inspectors having to deal with M&Es, they're not one size fits all. They're persons, and they will be influenced by public opinion. I think a lot of auditors feel justified by those developments in scrutinizing M&Es more intense, more aggressively than if that wouldn't have happened. So yes, I think public opinion, the public perception of M&Es and how they behave in tax matters actually would and will show that future audits become more aggressive than you would like. But that's just a matter of fact, and I think M&Es please should be aware and should prepare to deal with it once it happens. And in my opinion, it's not just a question of whether it will happen. I think it's just a moment in time, so it's more a question of when it will happen.
So you might then expect that companies that have already been involved in audits and know what tax authorities behave like might then expect another behavior of the tax authorities, being more aggressive, more focusing on, yeah, you should pay your fair share of tax. What you're doing is not typically right or correct. So
yeah, well, I've been a tax inspector, let's say, half my career. And if I look back at when I was at the tax administration and how the tax administration is operating at this moment in time, it already shows quite a substantial difference in attitude. And it will be even more aggressive and more different than over the last 10, 15 years, because that has been a gradual, let's say, development. If we look at the importance of attitude, I think it will change. And sometimes I've talked to tax directors who told me, well, yeah, I understand what you're saying, and transfer pricing is difficult, and yes, there's a lot of focus, but hey, I feel rather comfortable because I'm having an operation running for 10 years, and I didn't change that much, and at the same time, I didn't have any major tax audits, and the ones that were occurring didn't result in major disputes. So I feel rather comfortable. And then I always congratulate the person and say, well, you're a lucky one, good for you, but please think about the fact that even if you don't change, the world around you will change. And looking back at what we started with in this seminar, the world has changed substantially, very substantially, and it will very likely also mean that the way that you have been dealing with the authorities will also change, even if you just stay doing the same as you have done for the last 10 years. So be aware of what happens around you, will help you to prepare.
Well, indeed, Richard, but perhaps also comparing what you're now saying with the situation in which we are now. We're now in a situation where there's a lot of transparency, a lot of information available, publicly available. Mm-hmm. And that might be also a driver to initiate an audit, because we also know profit allocation is something that is on the international agenda for quite some time already. And what you already mentioned previously, the mandatory disclosure rules. Mm-hmm. Also another form of, I need to know more about structures, the need to know, is it done correctly? Is there a case of potential tax avoidance? So I would say, from my point of view, transparency is really a tool for perhaps tax authorities to even better initiate a tax audit than perhaps previously could be done.
Yeah, I think you're right. Transparency will allow a lot of tax authorities to access a lot of data that they may not have been access to in the past. I think a lot of potential considerations to conduct an audit may come from interpreting more information, more data than have been available before. I think if you look at the transparency as is it a good thing? I think yes, it's a good thing, and it will establish some sort of a level playing field, and that's the intention of it all. But if you think about how it actually will conduct in practice, it's not that easy to, let's say, to do something with all the data that is being shared across countries, across tax administrations. Even for very highly educated tax administrations, it's a challenge to actually manage the data. And one of the risks, and then we're back to the controversy angle, one of the risks of the increase of transparency is not just that you are targeted for an audit, because, okay, that happens, and we have to live with that, but having the data shared is just part of the overall challenge. Data is about facts. Is about
so transparency is about facts.
Transparency is about facts. You need to know what happens, and if there's certain payments, okay, you need to know that the payments have been made, and if there's a transfer of assets, you need to know that it happens. And but the thing about the data, the facts, is that you need to interpret them. You need to combine the facts into some sort of a reasoning, a storyline that actually tells you, well, there's something wrong, or it all is turning out to be okay. So interpreting the facts becomes much more difficult if you have a huge bundle of facts to look at. And one of the risks that you may see is that, well, there are people, tax inspectors, tax auditors, will look at that huge information package, and they may just use the data that supports their primary vision.
So it would likely be something of cherry picking then.
Yeah, it's there's a likelihood that the larger the bundle of data will become, the more obvious it will be that just parts of it are being used, and then it's about what part is being used. And if you look at the same data, you may have different perceptions about what you're seeing and what you're looking at. If you look at the slide, two people looking at the same facts, just a number of sticks, but they give a different answer, and that's, I think, a major risk in the increase of the data available to all the people, all the tax authorities across the world, is that they look at the same but perceive it and interpret it in a different way.
So you would then say, well, in order to create less room to for differences in interpretation, you would need to create, let's call it a level playing field, a situation where all the facts are the same, and you can easily have a certain understanding about it.
Well, yeah, the facts are the facts. You cannot alter facts because they're just that, they're facts. If you need, and as I said just now, you need to interpret the facts, you need to combine certain facts into a coherent storyline that tells the story, let's say, that relates to the company and the transactions that you're looking at. That means most of the time that you make a certain combination of facts that supports the transaction, supports the storyline. And I think if you want to deal with that bundle of information in an efficient way, there are two options to go. You can either say, well, these are the facts, have your way with it, and see what you make of it.
Sometimes I can hear another option, which is then try to
Yeah, the other option.
Help.
The other option may be to guide in this way the authorities into interpreting those data, and let's say provide also the context in which to view those data and to interpret the one. So combine the data with your storyline, make the right combinations, make the right context that allows the authorities to actually understand the facts better, and maybe avoids them to focus on areas that are irrelevant. But if they don't know, they might still go there before they come to the conclusion that
so
it is
as a
irrelevant.
taxpayer, you have the ability to, say, steer the process of a tax audit by guiding the tax authorities through the bundle of data, as you say.
Yeah, so guidance, yes, and it starts before an audit even takes place, right? Because this will also start before an actual audit will take place. Tax authorities will have selection criteria. They will have some sort of a risk analysis on where to put their audit in place. Being able to tell the story and to avoid being selected, well, is something that is of great value.
So it sounds to me that you need to have some kind of a strategy.
Well, it would help, yes.
Okay, in order to know how to react when a transfer pricing audit occurs.
Yeah.
So moving on to the word strategy, Richard, stating that less than 10% of the enemies has an audit strategy, a specific tax or transfer pricing audit. Would that be a statement that is legit?
Maybe it's a bit extreme, 10%, but I think a lot of M&Es still have what I call some sort of a default behavior in terms of controversy. That is, they focus on having a transfer pricing policy in place because they need to. It's compliance, and they implement it, so everything is put in order. But they will deal with an audit when it comes up. They will deal with an audit when the auditor is entering the building and starts asking questions, and then they will respond. And that's, I think, most of the M&Es have, in general, a bit like such an ad hoc approach. But there are also M&Es that spend more time and effort into preparing for the likelihood of an audit and making sure that whenever you are confronted with an audit, you are already, let's say, positioned to deal with it. And you have the people in place, the documents in place, and you have some sort of a procedure how to manage the audit in a way that it minimizes, let's say, efforts. It may improve the speed of the audit and the length it takes to come to a conclusion. But there are also, let's say, a lot of M&Es that have a bit of a hybrid approach. They do bits of just sit and wait and bits of preparation. But I think the message here would be still, in my opinion, too few of the M&Es actually make an effort in preparing for an audit, for a dispute. And at the end of the day, experience shows that it may save considerable time, costs, and frustration when you, let's say, move the effort a bit upfront in time.
Yeah, indeed. I think Richard will also talk later on a bit about what should I do during a tax audit or transfer pricing audit. What kind of information should I provide? Should I be fully transparent or a little bit cautious about the information I'm trying to provide, and the answers to the questions that tax authorities are asking during the tax audits. So indeed, I fully agree with you, Richard. Also, what I see, a lot of companies not really having a strategy, and not even perhaps thinking about what should I do in order to prepare for a tax audit.
Yeah, I think if you look at the developments over time and putting it also into the perspective of transparency, Emil, I think having some sort of thoughts and consideration on how to deal with it now becomes more relevant than before, because transparency also makes M&Es forcing them to think about consistency and think about, let's say, the scope of a dispute more than before. In the past, a lot of disputes were being managed locally. They resulted in some sort of a negotiation and some sort of a compromise on local level with tax authorities of one country, and then everything was settled and back to normal until the next audit came. I think transparency now shows that if you take a position into a certain dispute in one country, that you at least should consider the potential impact of that position in respect of the other countries that may have similar transactions and will, or you should at least consider the fact that they will become aware of your position in your dispute with the first country. So
yeah, so the bigger picture is really important, the helicopter view, not focusing on the trying to solve the audit itself, but also looking at potential consequences in other jurisdictions. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, I think in general, and obviously there will be some exceptions to that rule, but you might also almost say that there is no dispute in transfer pricing that is isolated to one country. Well, by nature, it involves two countries, obviously, but it's likely to have an impact on more than one country within an M&E. So you should be thinking about that. You should at least have a conscious decision on how to deal with such a dispute, and it may be different from one M&E to another. It may be different in terms of what countries are involved, on how you want to make your choices in that respect. But it should be a conscious choice, because otherwise you may become rather surprised or ambushed by another country's perspective.
Okay, so while now I'm going to an audit, how should I prepare an audit? Because in my head a lot of questions arise, but also I've also been confronted with questions from taxpayers asking, what should I do in a tax audit? Should I be very proactive, or is reactive more the way to go? I know, Richard, there is no one size fits all. I mean, you have to look at each specific situation as a situation on its own. So indeed, I hear you say there's a lot of factors that play an important role: persons, the people, even the industry where you're in, the tax authorities, the person of the tax authority that you're dealing with. But still, to get some practical insights, what do you think we should do, or at least in a tax audit?
Yeah, well, I'm always in favor of being proactive, but sometimes that's not the way to go. And it depends on the countries involved, the culture that you're dealing with, or the complexity of the case sometimes. Well, my first initial answer to a question like that is it depends, which is the standard question on any transfer pricing related question. So it depends, but thinking about proactive versus reactive, I think what you should, as an M&E, always want to establish is that you're in control of the discussion. And that sometimes may also involve timing of the discussion, or having a discussion may be unavoidable, but you may be able to steer it in a way that you will be able to discuss it with a certain party, like a certain country tax administration, instead of three at the same time, or you might have a preference to discuss it with a certain tax authority because of the accessibility, the expertise that's available there, and which will allow you to have a more, let's say, business-like discussion instead of an educational effort to that authority's perspective. So having a proactive way will, in my opinion, allow you to, where to the extent possible, let's say, take control over the process. Being just reactive and sitting and waiting until somebody knocks on your door, that eliminates your means of being in control of the process that you face.
You don't want to be a sitting duck.
You never want to be a sitting duck, you cannot avoid being controlled. You cannot avoid being audited, but you have certain opportunities to manage the process in your advantage.
And I'm looking in the audits that I have been involved in, mostly I see they are about facts. Facts aren't clear.
Yeah, I think in general, facts are taking about 80% of the discussion time and efforts in a transfer pricing dispute. Well, facts are facts, but as we discussed just before, you will have to interpret the facts. So showing the facts and making clear what the facts are, but also combining it with the context that allows you to have the interpretation that should stick to that specific transaction. It takes a lot of time, and sometimes that time can be saved or managed by making sure that you are able to present a very coherent, very concise storyline that is very transparent about the facts, but also very clear about how they should or could be interpreted.
So what I hear you say is communicate the storyline, not just individual facts.
Yeah, because if you do not combine the facts with a storyline, one thing is sure, then any tax auditor, any tax inspector looking at those facts will be forced to invent its own story, which may quite be different from your own intended storyline. So guide a tax official through the data will sometimes avoid having another view developed because there's no need to, or at least make sure that you're able to speed up the process in actually getting to the discussion points. So yeah, you prepare a guidance and don't take a too passive approach, I would say, because once, and that's being a tax inspector for half my life, once a certain way of reasoning sets in the mind of a tax auditor, it might be the wrong one, but then getting back from that mindset takes a lot of more effort than making sure that he's going through the right steps. Let's say from the first instance.
Manage the process.
Please manage that process. Yes.
Right. Well, Richard, also looking a bit more at the controversy landscape, because we have retroactive, we have proactive, national, international. What kind of instruments do we have now available, and how can I use them? Just to put them on the slide.
Yeah, I think this is a slide just for illustration purposes. It may not even be complete. I think what it shows is that you have a lot of options to choose from, or at least to take into consideration. There are a lot of differences in being proactive or be retroactive. If you decide to be more retroactive, just prepare and wait until they look for you. You will have an audit, maybe an adjustment, and you go through the national procedure of having an appeals and litigation in a certain way. That may be an option. Another option might be that if you think about the dispute in place, that you do not want the whole length of that procedure and you want to go for a more proactive approach and start trying for an APA, for instance, a unilateral one. But if you want to have it more comprehensive, you may want to include also the other countries involved, like a bilateral APA. So,
but it also depends on the situation, right? Because not in all situations an APA is possible.
Exactly. So these are just visualizations of the instruments that you might have available or that you might consider in using. And sometimes you may want to use a different instrument in a different country, depending on, let's say, the accessibility, the expertise level. but it shows you that you need to consider the options that you have. For instance, if you only focus on national regulations, it might limit your opportunities. Whereas if you focus on some international instruments available, like an MAP, a mutual agreement procedure, it might also trigger different parties to be involved in the dispute. It may be quite a different discussion when you're actually having to deal with a local auditor versus a situation where you have to deal with competent authority. Same issue, different persons involved, different expertise levels, but also different toolkits available. It might be the case that in an international level, a mutual agreement procedure may result in a different outcome with the agreement of the other country, but only because it's on an international level and not just on a local level dispute. So a lot of opportunities, and my main worry sometimes is that there's too little attention and too little consideration of the options available in making a concise and a specific conscious choice on how to deal with a certain issue.
Yes, thank you, Richard. So yeah, well, a lot of people ask, what should I do and how to handle a transfer pricing audit? What are the things I should definitely not do? How should I not act towards authorities? But also I hear saying, it's a part of your strategy. Do I manage, have a certain policy for managing tax audits, or is it just putting out fires? I hear you say you should be able to justify and substantiate your transfer pricing strategy, your policy. And when thinking about substantiation, I already think about transfer pricing documentation. I mean, transfer pricing documentation, also a form of transparency. What we see now with the master file, local file, but also the CPCR, etc. It provides a lot of data, a lot of transparency on facts.
Yeah, and if it's a proper one, it should also tell a story. So transfer pricing documentation is a very important part of the current documentation package, so to say, that explains what has happened. But documentation by nature is looking backwards. It's looking at something that already happened, and obviously that is also, let's say, the focus of an audit. So that's they're both looking backwards. But if you're looking at how to manage your future disputes, documentation alone is not enough, and you see a lot more focus already on going a step further than just documenting what has happened in the past. And let's assume that you were able to document perfectly about what happened last year. If you do not, let's say, manage that you are able to, in time, respond to changes within the organization or incidental transactions that happen this year or will occur next year, you will likely be at risk of running into discussions where the consequences of those developments have not been thought through properly. And if you're running behind the facts, you can only, properly document it as being happening. It has happened this way, and you may try to, let's say, do some damage control, but you would rather avoid to control damage.
So in that respect, you would say, well, transfer price documentation itself or alone seems not to be sufficient anymore. There's definitely a need for something else, something additional.
I think a lot of tax authorities now are starting to let's say, take the next step and require not just having transfer pricing documentation in place, but also having the tools in place to make sure that you not only have thought through the documentation and the policy, but that you're also able to show that you're properly implementing that policy and that you are taking some sort of an organizational measure that allows you to respond to changes that would require an adjustment of your transfer pricing policies in certain situations. So having a certain way of a control framework put in place to make sure that you not only document what has happened, but also are able to show to the authorities that you're able to make sure that you stay in control.
Yeah, so I have my transfer price documentation in place. I fulfill my compliancy obligation, so I'm in control, Richard.
Yeah, well then it may just happen that you're running off a cliff, as shown in the picture, because when you're sitting in the car and you've organized it very well, assuming no changes, you will be able to drive a straight way. But once there's a sharp bend in the way, and you do not respond, like in this picture, you would actually steer the wheel, you might fall off a cliff. So, and in my opinion, most of the M&Es in the world are dynamic. There are very few M&Es that are static, that are unchanged for a number of years. So you will need to steer. You need to adjust, you need to amend, and you need to at least evaluate whether you need to adjust.
You want to monitor it.
You want to monitor it. You want to be able to stay on the road, so to say.
So I would say, well, the statement, I have my documentation in place, I'm in control. Yes, you're in control relating to your compliance burden.
Yes.
It is all documentation hindsight. It's all previous years. But you're saying now, and I totally agree, Richard, being in control is not being in control only about previous years, but also towards now and in the future.
Yeah, I think future even is more important than ever. Being in control, I think compliance also is driven by a need and a desire to make sure that a company pays what it should pay, and it should provide tax authorities enough, let's say, hold on to evaluate properly. And so it's a very important part of being in control, but it's not the full picture. If I need to make a distinction, documentation package is looking backwards, and some sort of a control framework actually looks forward. Control means being able to influence. Just looking backwards, you cannot undo facts. You need to report them, you need to describe them, and then you need to interpret them in a way, and hopefully
steering is not possible anymore.
You cannot steer in the past. You can only steer in the future. So the combination of proper documentation, but also allowing yourself to steer, to influence future actions or avoid future risks, that together will provide you with the best, let's say, control and the best situation or position to justify yourself to tax authorities.
Totally agree, Richard. Totally agree. But also looking at the mentality of the tax authorities now, perhaps expecting to be much more aggressive, but also, in my opinion, tax authorities are shifting more from tell me to, well, show me.
Yeah, it's a bit of a, I think, a true statement. Tell me is about the concepts, the policies, and a lot of transfer pricing questions and discussions start about, well, that's nice, but show me how you have implemented that policy, and not how you implement it once, but how you maintain that it is still accurate over time. And that's all to do with risk analysis by the tax authorities. If you're able to have a policy and you can show that you have implemented it in a way that is consistent with the policy, and you also have the opportunity to show how you manage to stay on the road, so to say, the likelihood may be that if that all is being disclosed and discussed and agreed with the tax authorities, you would likely not be on top of the list to come up for an audit because there's sufficient comfort, which is not the same as you will not be audited, but it's all about let's say priorities. And it might very well be also that if you have all these things together, so you have documented it, you have your policy, you have implemented it, and you can show how you have implemented it, but you also have a monitoring process in place that you can actually steer to stay on the road, that it will also allow you to have a very efficient audit. Because when you're audited, then the time to actually conduct the audit may be very less than otherwise. So it will help you to manage capacity, to manage time, and stay in control.
So the right documentation should be in place, and that enables you to mitigate a tax audit.
Documentation will always be necessary, because if you're not, you will face a bit of a burden of proof issue, and in transfer pricing disputes, burden of proof is a major issue. The one that needs to prove something has a challenge cut out for him. So if you're able to avoid that you're being challenged with a burden of proof, you're in a relatively comfortable situation, unless facts are different. But let's assume facts are facts.
Well, Richard, during this, let's say 15 minutes that we've spoken about controversy, audits, transfer pricing audits, tax audits, you do get a feeling an audit is something negative. But I was just wondering, could you now say that an audit is also perhaps a kind of an instrument for a multinational in defending its transfer pricing policy or transfer pricing method? Because what I already previously said is, well, in some cases, it's really you are really unable to get a ruling or an APA.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at a tax audit or a transfer pricing audit, it might be an instrument.
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a tricky name, instrument. I think an M&E is not likely to actually have an audit upon request because they want it so badly. But in practice, yes, sometimes an audit being conducted and closed successfully, so without adjustments, may be very helpful in convincing a next auditor that it all fits and there should not be reason to worry.
A next auditor in another jurisdiction.
Another country, for instance, assuming that you have a structure where you have similar operations in Germany, France, and England, and Germany has conducted an audit, gone through the whole transaction, reviewed it, and came to the conclusion, well, we agree, there's no adjustment. It doesn't guarantee you that the French and the UK authorities will have the same opinion, but it will help to take away some of their worries that it is unacceptable.
Yeah.
So having an official authority looking at it, reviewing it, and concluding that it's okay, it will certainly help you to defend to the next tax authorities, unless, of course, there are different facts involved.
Indeed. So on the assumption that the facts are in principle the same.
Yeah.
So let's say next to transfer pricing documentation, you want to have your so-called transfer pricing control framework. Mm-hmm. I'm not really aware whether there is a real format for that, because looking at the transfer pricing documentation, OECD style, you have the master file, local file, which in principle already provides what it should look like or what it should include. I'm not aware really that there is a real format for the transfer pricing control framework, but I do know there are items that need to be included, or at least I expect them to be included.
Mm-hmm. I think if you're asking me to tell you how to, what it should look like, I wouldn't have an answer. my answer would be it should tell, it should show how you identify your risks involved with your transactions and your considerations. So you need to identify those properly, and not just once, but on a consistent and continuous basis. And you should put in place a process that supports that and allows you to also document it, because having it is not something of itself. You need to be able to show that you have a process in place that actually identifies your risks and allows you to take action upon them.
Would you then expect, just as a short question from my side, that the framework is another kind of a report or a document?
Well, likely in practice it would help if you have some sort of a process how you do it. But the control actually doesn't come from the report. It comes from the actions that you take to monitor and to control. So yes, it may help you if you have a document stating how you're organized in a certain way, how to monitor the processes, how to make sure that you get the information out of the organization in time for you to take action if necessary. But just putting it in another report and put it on the shelf in the closet actually won't help you.
It's a bit like a substance over form, right?
Yeah, if it's just another report, it's a waste of time and effort. If you don't make a report out of it, but you actually do it, and once questions on how you are in control of your transfer pricing, you're able to show actually what you do to make it to control it and to manage it and to monitor it. That would be much better than just to have a report and don't do it.
I totally agree, Richard. I totally agree. Well, looking at the time, Richard, our 60 minutes are almost up, and we're coming to the end of this webinar. We've spoken about transparency, about strategy, how to deal with a tax audit, how to prevent a tax audit, or at least mitigate risk of having a transfer pricing audit. We touched upon a transfer pricing control framework. A lot of things we've said, but what would now be our main takeaway for this webinar?
Well, I think if you look at the last slide, the pictures tell you more than 1,000 words. There's a lot of audit activity coming, and you can choose to just stare into the headlights and see it coming, and freeze and not doing anything.
What's your reaction when you see it? Yeah.
And it will be different from one M&E to another. There's still no one size fits all, and if you're in a limited number of countries, it may be totally different than if you are scattered around the globe, active in 100 countries, including African, Asian, European, American countries, all different angles to look at. But I think the main takeaway is be aware of the fact that things are coming. Audits will come, triggered by a lot of circumstances, but they will come, and they will require a response from M&Es. And well, but that's my humble opinion. Sitting still and freeze will not be the most efficient defense.
Yeah, you do not want to be a sitting duck at this moment.
No, you don't want to be the rabbit in the headlights, but you also do not want to be the sitting duck, because even if you're comfortable, it's not about what you feel like. It's about what the world around you feels like. And if they're pointing a gun at you, you should better make sure that they're not hitting the target. So prepare. That's the only main takeaway that I can give in general. Prepare, and preparation may be different for any company,
but it's key.
But be prepared, and at least do not be surprised. I think you do not want to be surprised in dealing with tax controversy. You want to be prepared. Whether you do that in a certain way will depend very much on your appetite, your risk appetite, the capabilities that you have, and the opportunities that become available, but making a conscious decision on how to manage your upcoming audits, I think is time well served.
Yes, indeed. Well, Richard, thank you. So key takeaway, be prepared. Do not be surprised. I would like to thank all of the listeners in this webinar. If you want to re-listen to this recording, it will be available on our website shortly. Again, thank you very much for joining this webinar, and hope to see you soon in the next webinar. So thank you. Keep safe.